All right. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah. I'm not like I don't have fancy exercises for us to do. Beforehand, I would say like let's take a lap around Van der Steur and then come back inside. I'm pretty sure we will be up by then, or people will just walk away. After that, welcome to the session. This will be on AI ethics and policy. I'm Fukosi Marivate. I'm one of the organizers of the Indaba, and for this year and kind of probably also for the next few years, we will be trying to have kind of these discussions that are also connected to kind of societal impact. So one of the things that becomes very important is to discuss these intersections of ethics and then also intersections of policy around all our different kind of living spaces. What you'll note on the policy side, connected also to yesterday's session on AI machine learning in Africa, is policy is very different across the different countries. And this doesn't come because, only, hey, people might not yet have thought about some things, but then also we have different values across the different countries. So understanding where those come from and how they shape the policy is very important. So to begin with, it seems, some of the panelists had a very long night yesterday discussing and getting ready.
It was a very important part of the
Yeah, it was very important, and they were getting ready for this, and I'm very, very happy for that because it means that today's discussions are we're very good. So the session is going to be split into three. We're going to have an interactive session now, so that's the thing that will wake us up from Oshunde, and then we're going to have some talk on fairness by Timnit. And then lastly, which I think it's not really lastly, it's the bulk of this. The session is going to be a policy session of some great people that we've actually scoured all over to be able to be here and allow for you to be able to interact with. There are some preset questions, but I really don't want to focus on those. I really want the audience to be able to ask questions and us discuss things. What you'll find in this area, a lot of times there's no answers as yet, and it's great actually then continuing to have these conversations. So to begin with then, we'll start with an ethics exercise, and Oshunde will then take us on. Yeah.
I hope not. Okay, so an ethics exercise. I think it's one of those things. Ethics is one of those things where everybody is technically an expert. So one of the things I try to do when I have to deal with ethics and policy and artificial intelligence is just move the middle. Let's see. You just want to be in the middle of that. Okay, that's on the camera. Second considerations. So one of the things I try to do when I talk about ethics in AI is to try to get people's considered judgments or ethical intuitions about different uses of artificial intelligence. There's a question of how do you define artificial intelligence in the first place. We'll not even go into that. For the rest of the conversation, I'm going to try to use the idea, the working definition that we are dealing with algorithmic systems, data-driven algorithmic systems. That might be as complex or as simple as you want it to be. So one of the things I try to do over the past couple of weeks is to try to get a bunch of questions that get at people's intuitions on data privacy, the use of artificial intelligence in criminal justice systems, in national security systems and stuff like that. And the working hypothesis, at least the type of hypothesis you'd see in a lot of conversations, is that it's going to be very geographically dependent. So we had this, thank you for everybody who actually did the survey. We got about 100 responses. it turns out that I was a bit too ambitious in terms of splitting down the geographic distinctions. So we may not have statistically relevant results to report on this conversation. But let's see. So the types of questions we're asking is, how do you define artificial intelligence? There was significant diversity in this thing here. Somebody went as flippantly and said AI is artificial intelligence. I phrased the question weird, I guess. What is AI? Artificial intelligence. Like pulling the burden of definition backwards. And then there was this question of, well, whatever you define artificial intelligence as, if you're going to be talking about ethics is a very culturally dependent thing. So I was trying to get a sense of where people come from, not necessarily in terms of nationality, but what they identify as in terms of culture. So personally, I'm born and raised in Nigeria, but I haven't lived there in maybe 10, 15 years. So there is this weird intersection of Nigerian and American values that basically control how I go through life. So the idea here was to get each person's perspective, each person's signature, and go forward with, and see how that colors their conversations on ethics. So I'm going to walk through a couple of the questions, but in terms of the key interactive exercise for today, I think when we talk about ethics in any technological practice, I think most of the interesting conversations come down to actual walking through concrete case studies. And so we have a couple of case studies I want to explore with you. So keep these in mind. There's a conversation about facial recognition technology, social media, surveillance, and networking, conference networking. The conference networking question actually came up in the first day of this in Dabawi Bukosi. We were like, okay, we could have a bunch of people carrying around widgets, tracking who they're talking to. What are the ethical implications of that type of conversation, of that type of technology? Right. But before we even do that, there is a sense that we should have a framing conversation for how we will do these types of case studies. And the idea is that as we walk away from here today, when we go back into our development roles, wherever we come from, we have a stable, foundational, minimal framework for thinking about ethics, and as we try to develop technologies. All right. So let's see. I can just walk through our the results we sort of got from this. And the reason I'm pulling up the results is sort of to give you a sense of how much diversity there is in this space in terms of what people think is right versus wrong in the use of technology. So we ask, is it ethically permissible for companies to collect and sell my data? So this is an interesting question because many companies already do this. And so there is a sort of cognitive dissonance in the way, in what we think is ethically permissible and the way the world actually works. So there's a question of an ought versus an is. So most people disagree that companies should be able to collect or sell personal data. And I think that this is one of the strongest outcomes of this survey. There was little divergence on this point. And then there's this question of, should governments push for more personal access to data? Now this we see continuously. So in places like China and the United States, even in Europe, there is this idea that, there is a tension. Like there's a recent, this year we had the EU's General Data Protection Regulation that was trying to enshrine privacy rights. And one of the things they identify is this tension between the privacy rights that a person can expect and this need for national security, this need for public utility. So there's a sense that your data, technically, ethically, at least under most moral understandings of data, is technically yours. But there is a sense that there's a welfare angle to sharing that data more broadly to improve, commercial services, to improve public health surveillance and stuff like that. So there is this tension that I think it's not just in terms of privacy, it's also in terms of in terms of fairness. I think Tindy will talk about this tension between fairness and accuracy also. It comes up a lot in our conversation. So there's a lot of divergence here. The questions that gave the most interesting results were, I think, in the national security space. So as a background, I guess I didn't really introduce myself. I'm Ashandi Ashaba. I work at the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation is a think tank that contracts with governments around the world. Half of the work we do is national security related. The other half is health and infrastructure type work. So the whole point is that we work in the public interest. We try to be as open and transparent as possible in the way we do research and publish our research. But there is a significant amount of our attention that goes to how do we advise countries about national security. And it's a very, for putting it mildly, it's a very controversial area. We have recent conversations with the CCW. Do you allow certain types of weapons, especially with the use of artificial intelligence, to be the norm in the international space? So I think part of the goal of this exercise was to get people's understandings, people's intuitions about what's allowable in war and where does artificial intelligence play a role there. And I think most people agree that war is not necessarily a good thing, but it's a different step to take it from not necessarily being a good thing to being always wrong. And so you see this argument in I think, Michael Waltz a while ago with books talking about humanitarian military interventions. So the history of war is the history of unethical use of force. But recently we've been seeing this situation where, like in Rwanda, you have international agencies with peacekeeping forces. There's a sense that they should be allowed to engage in war for some welfare benefit, in this case keeping the peace, preventing genocide. So this question of, are you an absolute pacifist versus are you a pragmatic pacifist versus are you a warmongering hawk? That's an issue that you're going to have to deal with in more detail. And it's increasingly important, especially given that most of you will work in tech companies that will be at the cutting edge of artificial intelligence, and at some point our government is going to come up to you and say, oh, we want you to develop this technology. And you start thinking about this dual-use problem. If I develop this technology, well, they might not be explicit about it. They might tell you, develop the technology because we want to use it for this well-defined public good problem. And then you might be thinking, okay, if I go back and develop this technology, it can be repurposed for this nefarious purposes. So the question is, where do we draw that line? When do we say, okay, we're not going to develop these types of stuff? And figuring out that line is what I don't think I'm going to be offering any answers. I don't think anybody here can offer any answers when it comes to morality and ethics. But at the very least, we can talk about ethical frameworks. How do we even start asking the questions usefully as we develop technologies? So most people agree, or at least claim to agree, that war is always wrong. That's.
Why is there a % correct?
Oh, so it's just sorry. An explainability question. So I framed the survey in a way to allow me to better analyze the data. So it's a scoring mechanism. So from 1 to 5. There are no correct answers here. They are only. Yeah. So I'm hoping as we do the case studies, when we make an assertion or if we stake out a position, we argue for those positions as opposed to just trying to judge whether the position is correct. So it's not a question of correctness. Right. And so part of the goal of the survey was to start asking questions that slowly ramp up the complexity of the ethical dilemma and try to get a sense of where things break down. So there's a question of whether autonomous weapons are likely to make more mistakes than humans. And this is a hard one because we, technically speaking, already have autonomous weapons. And even though we say that we seem to disagree or seem to claim that they are not likely to make more mistakes, we already have examples like in mines, which are autonomous weapons. They are dumb autonomous weapons, but they make quite a lot of mistakes. Cluster bombs, cluster munitions, these are autonomous weapons and they make mistakes. The question is, does adding AI to this type of automation, does it actually improve the quality of decision making in this space? And that is a question we're going to have to deal with. So the next couple of questions, they're trying to gauge why people have moral compunctions about the use of autonomous weapons. there are two arguments. There is the argument that, oh, if you have an autonomous weapon and engaging in war, then you're violating the dignity of life. But then there's the other argument of not a question of dignity of life, but a question of accountability. If you have autonomous weapons engaging in war, then you don't have an accountable human behind that's going to take charge of any mistakes. They're going to be responsible for any mistakes that happen. So here I think we found that most people, they're sort of split on this. Most people will sort of agree that there is a dignity of life dimension to why we ban autonomous weapons, why we should ban autonomous weapons. And some people argue that there's an accountability question. Now, accountability is part of the A, is the A in the FAT star, in the FAT ML conversation. There's fairness, accountability, and transparency. And there is the question of how do we make systems more accountable? How do we make autonomous systems more accountable? All of you will probably be dealing with this question at some point in time going forward. But before, instead of walking through these, I'm going to maybe give us a framework, a basic framework for thinking about ethical questions, and then throw out the 2 or 3 case studies we had in mind, and have us converse, talk about the details of those case studies. So let's see. So there is this question. So one of the things that came up in the survey was this idea that technology cannot be ethical. Technology cannot be. There are no values involved embedded in technology, and it's an interesting conversation that's gone on for, I don't know, at least 50 years. There was a paper in the 80s by this guy Langdon asking if artifacts, which will include artificial intelligence, if artifacts have politics. Like, can you say that nuclear power is necessarily fascist or something like that? We have a similar situation here. Can you say that technology, specifically artificial intelligence, can you say it's anti-democratic? Can you say it's capitalistic? Can you say it's necessarily increasing inequalities in societies? And the answer is I think most of you would agree, is rather complicated. It's not the case that there are no values embedded in these technologies. It's a question of, well, where are these values coming in? How do we sort of interrogate those values? And so recently we've had conversations like, if you think about technologies like the printing press, like most people would agree, most people would argue that the printing press was a boon to society. It allowed for the dissemination of information very broadly. But then if you think about the implications of the printing press when it first came out, it allowed for the schisms in the church, the Reformation. Think about all the wars that followed the Reformation due to this wide dissemination of data. We are seeing the same thing with social media technologies. Like, in a sense, it's a good thing. It enabled color revolutions around the world, which allowed for more democratic governments. But then there is this negative part that comes into play. And for every technology, including artificial intelligence, there is this idea of values embedded into it. But I think for artificial intelligence, it's particularly interesting because we are learning from data. Data embeds a lot of our cultural values, a lot of our cultural assumptions, a lot of our cultural understanding of the world. And so, in a sense, we are when you create artificial intelligence, you're actually embedding the values directly through the data you're learning from. So it becomes at what point do we say, okay, our data does not reflect the values we care about? How do we adjust the models we are learning based on the data to something we care about more? No answers yet. I think we are working through it. But again, it's something that each and every one of you is going to have to deal with going forward. There was a question in the survey, like, are they prohibited because they cannot be held accountable? This is a question of whether, essentially part of the question here is, do you think that there is some type of inherent moral agency in artificial intelligence? And most people, I think, sort of agree in the sense that we can say something about ethics for artificial intelligence, essentially ascribing morality to an artifact. Whether that's true or whether it's just a useful idealization or useful fiction, still working through it. We're going to have to figure that out. I already mentioned the dual use concern. So another part of the conversation in ethics and AI is this idea of AI for good. I think most of my titles will have question marks because I don't have answers. When we say AI for good, so one of the prime statements, conceptions of this idea of developing artificial intelligence for good is the Essilima principles. There are a couple of principles, I think there are about 31 principles in there or something like that. A couple of them try to target this. It says, okay, for example, the goal of AI should be to create beneficial intelligence, under the assumption that we know what beneficial is. Like, we have this dual use problem we already talked about. You design an artificial intelligence system with the best possible intentions, but it's being used for something else. Would we say that's a beneficially developed AI system? Even does intention lead to the quality does it give you the full description of the moral import of a system? And there's also the question of value alignment. This comes up a lot in reinforcement learning. How do you make sure that you've designed the right reward function for your model to learn, to achieve a goal? And sometimes we're seeing the situations where you think you've designed the right reward function and you have this reward hacking situation going on. Now, when you start applying those types of models in social applications, you can imagine all sorts of negative impacts. And I didn't quite get to this in the survey because even though we had 100 people, I split the global geography too finely. So it's not enough to say something statistical about differences in ethical iterations. But we're going to have to worry about what are the plural conceptions of what is good. Like what somebody considers to be a good thing in China is going to be different from what an American would consider a good thing. We have the primary example of that paper from 2 years ago. What was that paper? Criminality inference?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, a couple of my students back in the United States, they're Chinese, and I asked them. I was presenting this in class, and a couple of them came up to me afterwards and said they didn't necessarily think it was such a bad thing because there is a cultural history of physiognomy, trying to understand people's attitudes, people's personalities based on their how they physically present, and so there is this.
There's like a great blog post about this.
Mm-hmm.
Mitchell and Blaze called Physiognomy's New Face.
Mm.
So it touches on that, but also like a whole host of new computer vision techniques that are.
Yeah. So it's a deep concern we're going to have to deal with. How do you what are the cultural values embedded in how we react to technologies? For example, in the United States, most people saw that paper and they physically recoiled from it. There was also the other conversation about trying to infer sexual preferences based on how people present on social media interfaces. So those are extreme examples, but I'm hoping it drives home the point that there are plural conceptions of what is considered good, and it's culturally dependent sometimes. And then there's this last issue of adversarial dynamics. This is the absolute pacifism versus pragmatic pacifism. So you want to make the world a safer place. You want to make sure that people live good, fulfilling, safe, peaceful lives. The government asks you to develop an artificial intelligence model to do some type of national security thing. You say, no, I'm not going to do it. We had this conversation with Google Maven earlier this year. When you say no, what does that mean? So there is a sense of morality at the individual level, and then there's a sense of morality at the global level. You saying no has implications for the country, but there's also other countries. Do AI researchers in China have the same moral compunctions? What does it mean for people to have different moral compunctions in a world that's adversarial? That's a question I think we don't have any answers to, but we need to be more sophisticated in how we think about it. And I'm not arguing for one way or the other at this point. So we are not likely, I made the point already, we are not likely to come up with hard answers on this point, but we need to have a framework for talking about the questions. I like this particular framework. This is from Santa Clara University. There's a group there, the Marcula Center. They do work on trying to understand the ethical import of technologies. So what we're going to try to do here is examine frameworks, conceptual frameworks for answering ethical questions on technology, look through a couple of case studies, and then once we've sort of primed our intuition pumps on these problems, we're going to start thinking about how do we create routines. It's like basically nudging ourselves in development to create more ethical artificial intelligence. So we know this. I think most of you here are comfortable with the idea that artificial intelligence models, they are flawed. But oftentimes when we discuss this, we talk about this in the context of just a single model. We say the model is biased. But then there is an issue of post-implementation, and increasingly we are seeing this. So there's an example in the United States where you develop a model that's trying to identify risk of child welfare abuses, and then you have people taking the model, even if it's predictively accurate for risk. How the social workers actually use the model changes the moral import of the model. Yeah, oftentimes you see this discretion problem where somebody is using a model, is predicting something, they say, oh, I don't believe the model, I'm going to do this thing instead. That even if the model is unbiased, how people use it changes how it's received. And to pull this a little bit more broadly, there is a sense that you can't just think about algorithms on their own or AI systems on their own. You have to think about how they're embedded in society, how they're embedded in decision pipelines, how they're embedded in the culture. So one of the examples I use is this idea of the criminal justice system in the United States. They're different, we can think about it as a pipeline of decisions embedded in society. There are different parts of the system where algorithms can be used. And even if you have perfectly predictively valid algorithms being used, there are pathologies in the system that might change, that might lead to biased outcomes long term. So we don't get off the hook by just making sure our models are good, are unbiased. We need to figure out how they're embedded in the system, how we design them so that they can circumvent or short circuit any long-term problems in the whole system. And then there are these standpoint considerations. Who's affected by technology and who gets to develop technology? So oftentimes so there's this push to democratize AI right now, and that the idea there is that if you're not part of the decision-making process in making artificial intelligence, then any problems that come up, you have no say, you have no voice in how to address those problems. And sometimes even the problems the people designing are not aware of the problems because you're not in the room at all. And one of the things I tend to work on is this long-term effect, systemic effect. So you've looked at the algorithm on its own, you've looked at it as it's embedded in a larger socio-technical system, but then there are these issues of, okay, I did my best to design the best possible model here and now for the short term, but in the long run, there are these second-order effects. Think about if you outsource, if you figure out a way to automate firefighting, you develop artificial robots that do firefighting perfectly, better than humans. Over the years, a couple of decades, humans stopped learning how to do firefighting. And then two centuries down the line, the robots break down, and you have this diminished resilience. These types of systemic negative feedbacks that occur, even if you have the best possible intentions, the best possible implementations, you have to worry about those. So I put up a couple of them here that I worry about. There's the future of work concern. There's the feedback, runaway feedbacks in decision pipelines, and then there's the representational harm that comes out from work from Kate Crawford. Okay. Let's work through a couple of, we have about 12 minutes. I'm going to put up a couple of case studies, and I'm going to try to ask you to discuss among yourselves for about 3 to 5 minutes. If you're thinking about the algorithms that are being used in these types of systems, what are the problems that might come up? How do you recruit as many perspectives? What are the ethical considerations, and what are the fixes for those problems? So the first is this idea of the use of facial recognition technologies. So security, convenience, whatever, or maybe just faddishness, is pushing countries, agencies, to explore the use of biometric technologies for for either tracking or for understanding for tracking or for security. And you've been approached as an AI startup to develop an FRT model to track migrants. So this is a huge thing, Syrian migration crisis. Before that, there was the whole thing with sub-Saharan migrants moving into Europe through the, I believe it's, I forget the doesn't matter where, but there is issue of tracking migrants. And there is a social welfare aspect to this. You want to make sure that anybody immigrating, either legally or illegally, is taken care of. They are not subject to being preyed upon by bad actors. So there is a good thing there's a good thing happening there. There's a good goal there. But it's also possible, and this came up in a conversation with a couple of researchers here. They developed a model for a particular good goal, and then their client took the model and said, well, we're going to consider using it for something a bit more broader than that. So how do we think through the potential dual-use technology, dual-use potentials for technologies? And if you're approached to do this type of work, what are the ethical considerations? What should you be thinking about? What steps should you go through to decide whether you should take the contract or not? It's useful to start thinking about the stakeholders, who's impacted, who gets to make the decisions and stuff like that, and what types of information would you need as an engineer to develop the system in the best possible way. So I think part of the question here is to try to drive home the point that there is no way an engineer or a whole cadre of engineers is going to understand migration policies in as full detail as maybe, say, somebody who's been studying for a long time. We see this often in other domains. So when you're developing models for criminal justice, for health, for law, you're going to have to recruit other perspectives, other expertise. So who would you pull in for this type of analysis? What types of ethical concerns and what values are underlying this type of technology? So discuss amongst yourself for about, so turn to your neighbor, talk to yourself for about 2 minutes. So this should be an easy one because it's been in use for a while. So think about if you're asked to develop one tracking records, see if I'm asked to develop what are the ethical considerations? So as you talk about it, I'll ask for a couple of people at the end to outbrief what they think about this particular case study. Does anybody have strong opinions on this that they want to talk about? So I would like somebody who would say yes to the contract, and somebody who thinks they should say no to the contract. Yes? Should you take this contract? Are you going to take the contract? Okay, why would you take the contract? Like, what considerations went into that decision? Okay, so we have somebody saying yes, they'll take the contract. So they say okay. Let's brief a little bit on this one. So a couple of people have expressed the idea that the preference for taking the contract because it's tracking a positive goal. You're trying to make the lives of migrants better, safer, more peaceful. And there's a caveat there that as long as the system is housed within a government, internally within a government, that's a good thing. Does anybody have opposing opinions on this point?
Not really opposing, but we were thinking if you had an IP license that would be conditioned on how stuff is used, but we're just saying that maybe it doesn't even exist, so that you could sell stuff with a
conditional licensing.
And I think that would solve a lot of conundrums, right? Because but you have to law enforce it. Right?
So there's also that's an interesting idea. Historically, I've not seen work on conditional licenses, and one of the things that worries me is France's example in the early 1900s, where when they liked some piece of technology and they said they had huge welfare value, they just basically nationalized the IP. Imagine countries doing that. Now, the other question that I didn't get your name, that she brought up was this issue of as long as it's housed within governments. There's also a question of how much do you trust the government, and that's not a trivial question. Yeah.
So I have more of a question, and I'd like anyone to respond. My question is about how and if AI is any different from other technologies. So in this context, say there was some biomedical way of tracking someone as well. How is AI different? And so if we're thinking about technologies in general, and we think historically about the way in which they've been regulated, controlled through politics and civil society, is this something fundamentally different?
I think that's a question for the panel we'll have afterwards. I think there's been a lot of conversation about this over the past 5 years in the AI revolution. So, one more case study. Well, I don't think we have time to talk about it, but another case study. Well, so most people agree that the use of facial recognition software systems is acceptable for law enforcement, and you might think by extension acceptable for government agencies. So there is a sense that yes, most people agree with that point. I'm curious to know if after thinking about this, your preferences on this have changed. I might do a second survey afterwards just to track that. There is also a more topical example, more topical case. All of these cases, they're actually projects that some government, some lab is working on at this point. There's the idea of tracking people's behaviors on social media, either for tracking radicals, for tracking terrorists, or there's the less benign aspect of, say, tracking mental health behaviors on people, trying to identify people who are at risk of suicidal thoughts and try to intervene early. So there's a potential positive aspect to it, but you can imagine all sorts of negative aspects. So instead of talking about this, I'll switch over to Timnit in a second. But I think a couple of key things come to mind. I think what people care about here in this session is, I have this powerful toolbox. I'm an AI expert. I'm asked to do something. Should I build this model? I don't have an answer for you. I don't think anybody can answer that question for you. But I feel like it's useful to identify a framework that's been useful in the research community for IRBs. This idea of the Bellman principles. So historically, there's an issue of, if you're going to design research, design interventions, what principles are going to guide those interventions. And there were a couple of principles involved. So in a sense, I'm treating the development of AI models as forms of interventions, forms of social engineering. I'm essentially treating it like an experiment. And I think the same principles apply, the idea of do no harm. Now I'm going to just go through them in their normative descriptions. There's the first, do no harm. The second, respect personal autonomy. The third, justice. Make sure you're fair. Assure fair distributions of benefits and burdens in your work. Now, it's easy, I think with most ethical things, it's easy to say do no harm. It's easy to say be fair. The devil is in the details. What does it mean to do no harm? What is a harm? What does it mean to be fair? If you're thinking, one of the things that we explore a lot is, does fairness mean the same thing across applications? If you're talking about fairness in employment practices versus fairness in insurance practices, are they the same conception of fairness? And I think Tim is going to go into this a little bit more. As a higher level framing, I think it's useful. The details suck. Furthermore, you have, as you develop your models, you have these extra things you have to worry about. But I think it's probably useful to just stop at this. Think through, as you develop models, the beneficence principle, the justice principle, and the respect for personal autonomy.
Okay. Thank you. Microsoft. Okay, we're going to have Timnit after. Okay, let me hit here. Timnit is just started as a technical co-lead at ethical AI at Google. And she just also finished her postdoc on fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics group at Microsoft Research, which I had an opportunity to visit while she was there. And yeah. Oh wait. Okay. Yeah, I'll switch you on. Oh, yeah. It'll be on. Yeah. Okay, and we'll do kind of the questions at the as part of the panel session. So if you have questions, just note them down. And at least you have a lot of stuff to throw to the front.
How do I keep track of time?
Oh, I'll give you.
Okay, so yeah. I want to just make sure.
Did you keep on switching off the phone?
Huh?
Did it go to sleep? Or?
No, it goes fine.
Yeah.
There we go.
You want to be?
Oh, sorry.
The camera's right there.
I'm going to make this really quick so that we can get to the panel and have some discussion. So what I want to do is I want to take about 15 minutes and give some examples of some things that might not look ethically questionable, but just might be because of systemic errors in like the models that are being used for certain things. As you know, like AI is everywhere, or we want it to be, right? Like we're all thinking about AI-ifying things. How can you use it for agriculture? How can we use it for this? How can we use it for that? I'm not talking about this AI, obviously. Although there are people who talk about singularity and a doomsday scenario where the robots are going to kill all of us and things like that. That's not what I'll talk about something less glamorous. So there are many places where they're using machine learning to do things like figure out, oh, there's my tab, to manage power systems, and that would be great in IDs, for example, where we lose, where we have issues with power every single day, water systems, like in the cars. So this is a very good example. This company is called HireVue, and HireVue. So the thing is, you find out about things that are happening every week, right? New things that are happening. This company called HireVue, what they do is they say you apply for a job, and most of the time you have like lots of recruiters sifting through resumes or something like this to figure out who to interview for a particular job, right? And so what they do is they have automated systems that look through the resumes, and they decide and they choose who to have in an interview. Furthermore, another product that they have advertised recently is that they now, in addition to being chosen for an interview, let's say when you're being interviewed, they'll record you on camera, and then once they record you, they will give verbal and nonverbal cues from your interviews to the person who interviewed you. And the way they do this is they use emotion recognition. So there's a company called Affectiva that does emotion recognition. So that company, so this is a good, after you brought up, like you might have a company that started with good intentions. So Affectiva, the founder is Egyptian, and she wanted to work on autism, right? So emotion recognition for autism, it helps a lot. But when HireVue is using emotion recognition, it's to give your potential employer some additional cues about how your interview is going. Now think about this. A lot of the people I talked to who are interviewed in HireVue, they had no idea that they were being under emotion recognition when they were being interviewed. Also, we don't know how well emotion recognition works, what kind of errors it has on different people. So HireVue has 600 companies as customers around the world, including Nike, including governmental agencies, including schools. For example, the UAE, the government of the UAE, uses HireVue to hire people. And then the stock market, a lot of it trading is done through automated systems, and sometimes instability in these systems makes the market go down, up, and down again. And so some of the things you were mentioning, if you're interested in these topics, I recommend that you read these two books. So one is Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction, and another one is Automating Inequality by Virginia Woolf. These two books are very U.S.-centric, but at least they give you an idea of some of the things that are happening in the U.S. So I started getting worried about this in 2016 when I read this article. So for Black in AI, I saw a lot of submissions where it would be good to talk about these kinds of things. So some people, you were talking about face recognition for law enforcement, machine learning for crime prediction. These things sound good in principle, but there are some issues that arise. So this 2016 article from ProPublica, for the first time I found out that there was machine learning algorithms that were being used to determine someone's likelihood of committing a crime again in the US. And so what happens is judges, when they try to decide how many years you should go to prison for, one of the things they look at is your likelihood of committing a crime again. Right, and now the way this was being determined was by this machine learning algorithm. And how was it trained? We were all in Dava like this whole week, right? So it's trained with using past data, and so if you are a Black woman, like I am in the US, you know that there are certain issues. There are certain neighborhoods that are heavily policed. There are certain, even for drug crimes, even though different populations consume drugs at the same rate, some are arrested at a much higher rate than others. So when you use this data that's already biased, this historical data, to then determine who's likely to commit a crime again, then you're going to have these feedback loops that he was talking about, like runway feedback loops that Osoni was talking about. So you're going to create more and more biased systems, right? Because you're going to have your training data that says this person is more likely to commit a crime again, and then they even have these predictive policing systems, right? So, like, let's figure out which zip code is more likely to have higher crime rates so that we can have more police at this zip code, right? So you have this biased historical data, you put it in your training data, you say that this zip code is more likely to have high crime, you send more police there. Because you send more police there, you're going to arrest more people. That's going to confirm your prediction that this zip code has higher crime rates, and then you're going to have this positive feedback loop where you're going to have a machine learning system that's getting more and more biased. And then you talked about, your session was great because it was a great preparation for my short little talk. You talked about social media surveillance. So last year, I signed a letter along with 50 other scientists about, again, something called the Extreme Vetting Initiative in the United States. So the Extreme Vetting Initiative was proposed by the Immigration, what is ICE? Immigration Customs Enforcement, yeah, enforcement. And ICE wanted companies like Microsoft and Google and IBM, I was at Microsoft at the time, to partner with ICE and help it design automated tools to monitor people's social network activity and determine if they'll be good citizens, if they should be allowed to immigrate, if they should, if they're more likely to be terrorists, et cetera, et cetera. Now there's two questions, right? One question is whether we should have these kinds of tools in the first place. So that's the kind of question we were talking about earlier. But what I want to focus on is whether the tools that we have at the moment are appropriate for this kind of task, even if we decided to do this task. And my answer is no, because natural language processing tools are they're not there. They have systematic errors. So here's an example. There was some guy, young Palestinian person, woke up one day and he wrote "Good morning" in Arabic, and Facebook translated to "attack them," and Israeli authorities arrested him without even checking to see what the Arabic version was, right? So there's two things going on here. One is language translation. A lot of people have been focusing on English to French, whatever, and these are getting better and better and better. But then language translation for under-resourced, Arabic is spoken by so many people. There's so many dialects. If you look at Amharic or Tigrinya, my native languages, the translation is pretty bad. So there's two things happening. One is the systematic error rates, and the second thing is this thing we call automation bias, which is the tendency of human beings to trust automated tools. So the authorities didn't even think to check the non-translated version. They just automatically assumed that this translated version was correct, right? So automation bias and these systematic biases, that combination is pretty dangerous. Another example is from my colleague, Adam Kalaid. So at Microsoft Research, Adam Kalaid and his collaborators showed that these word embeddings encode societal biases. So what are word embeddings? You can think about them as like a space, let's call it a space, in which words that you deem to be similar in some way are closer in this space than words that are deemed to be different, right? So words that you think are similar in some way are close in this space, and words that are far are different. So for example, and then you can use these word embeddings to train analogy generators. So you say, he's to brother as she is to, yeah, sister. Okay. He's to doctor as she's to, what? Doctor. But what does that generate? Nurse. He is to computer programmer as she's to homemaker, right? So you train this word embedding using, this was Google News, I think, textual corpus, right? And so it comes up with this kind of societal bias, and you might be like, why does it matter? Fine, like we have this word embedding, how does that affect anything? So let's go back to HireVue. That was doing automated analysis of resumes, right, to figure out who to interview. And so I have no idea how HireVue does anything. Oops, is that my phone? Sorry. I have no idea how HireVue does how their tool works. So that's one of the problems, right? It's a black box. But say that it's you can imagine maybe, because I said word embeddings are a space in which words that are similar to each other in some way are closer to each other in this space. And so let's say I'm looking for a computer programmer, right? And let's say that, here I have a resume and it says Java, Python, etc. And in my word embedding, I look for, Java, Python, C++, they're close to computer programmer. But then in my resume, I also see that this person is a quarterback in the U.S. It's like University of Vermont or whatever. That tells me this guy's probably like a white male. And then the same exact resume, and then you have other stuff that tells you this person's like a black female, right? And now what happens is that in my word embedding, because the man is closer to computer programmer than the woman, I can automatically discriminate between, I will have automatic gender discrimination if I use this type of system to do an automated, to decide who to hire to find, who to find, when you're looking for someone who's a computer programmer. So in the U.S., 1 in 2 adults is under a law enforcement face database, right? Not Facebook. So, when we're thinking about using face recognition for law enforcement, so it's unregulated right now. Nobody, 1 in 2 American adults is in law enforcement database. In China, there's face recognition everywhere. There's a company called ID for Africa here. I believe they're based out of South Africa, actually, that are trying to work with governments, African governments, to have biometric IDs and things like this. But before we have these things be ubiquitous, we have to think about, the social and structural problems. So here, again, if I take the U.S. in context, there are certain people who are heavily policed. If you look at China, there are certain Muslim minorities who are heavily surveilled. But then you also look at the systematic errors that we make in our face recognition, right? So this was the famous Google Photos thing, but my own work, so my work with Joybo Amini, who's my colleague at MIT Media Lab, we showed that. So if you look at we looked at something very simple, gender classification. So you look at a face and they classify if it's a male or female. Here, it's an API from these companies, right? So Microsoft has one, IBM has one, etc. And now you look at the darker and darker, this is for women, the darker and darker you go, the higher and higher you get to have the error rates. Now, this is binary classification, so the random chance is 50%, right? So random chance is 50%, and I'm getting to about 46% error rate. So I'm approaching random chance. So here's the interesting thing, is that when we just look at accuracy, so when you look at, so we collected our own data set that was very, very diverse by skin tone, by gender, etc. Because existing data sets, we couldn't even test, when we wanted to test out how well these APIs did on existing data sets. We couldn't even do that because most of them were overwhelmingly lighter skinned and overwhelmingly male. So we had to first, even though people have been working on face recognition forever, right, for many, many years. So we first had to create our own data set that was more balanced by skin tone, not race, because what does that mean? What does black mean? What is what, you know what I mean? It's by skin tone, so from light to dark, and also by gender.
Is that available, the data set?
Yes, it's available. It's called a Pilots Parliamentary. Yeah, if you go to gendershades.org, I think just look up gender shades and you'll find it. So when we first looked at just the overall accuracy, it's like 93%, 90%, 87%, just, ship it, 90% is kind of nice. It's a good number. But, so here's the data set I was talking about. So existing data sets are, very overwhelmingly light emitters. But when you, I guess that's what I want to say. When you look at the overall accuracy, it's 83%, 90%, 87%, right? But when you break it down, right, it's when you break it down by these different intersectional groups when you see the disparities in error rates getting higher and higher. But then the question is, who are the people who are heavily policed in the US? It's that group of people, where the error rate is even higher and higher, right? So imagine the Palestinian that got arrested, the translation was wrong, and he's more likely to be arrested than like other people in Israel, right? So what we're doing is we have this interesting thing that's going on where minorities of any sense who are not participating in the creation of data sets or technology, things are working worse for them. The error rates are higher, but then they're also more likely to be the targets of such technology. Now, when we think about autonomous weapons, who's going to be the recipient of autonomous weapons? So I just I want to spend like 1 minute talking about we don't know what biases we're propagating, right? So when you think about that little word embedding system, you don't know what's going to happen when it is part of a larger system which is determining someone's life, which is whether or not you're going to get a job. So imagine everybody in the world uses higher view to determine whether you're going to get a job or not. Say there's some error somewhere, you might not get a job anywhere, right? So what are the solutions? So in the fairness community, there's a lot of focus on, for example, what does fairness mean? Let's have some fairness constraints when we're training our models, et cetera, et cetera. So fairness, accountability, transparency. So I'll talk a little bit about transparency here. We have some technical solutions proposed. By the way, I'm involved in a conference called FATSTAR, Fairness, Accountability, Transparency. We're going to have our conference in February. We didn't have any submissions from African countries, which is sad, but I'm hoping that's going to be different next year. But we do have scholarships for people to attend our conference. So go to fatconference.org and check out the kinds of things people are working on. And if you are interested, we will have scholarships. But anyway, so again, as technologists, we can't ignore social and structural problems. We can't just be like, I'm not going to think about the politics or whatever. I'm just going to work on my thing. I recommend a paper called The Moral Character of Cryptographic Work. So this is a very interesting paper by a cryptographer. And he talks about how he thinks that the failure to prevent mass surveillance is a failure in the cryptographic community. Because in cryptography, they stripped all politics out of it. They're not thinking about, who the surveiller is and who's being surveilled or anything. They're like, Alice and Bob are blah, 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 and then here, let's just focus on the technical part. And when you do that, you start getting into these situations where you're creating systems that might harm certain groups of people. And so in the US, for example, who are the people who are being overly policed, and what kind of error rates do we have in face recognition? And when I'm talking to people in different countries, like in Zambia, I was talking to people who want to, for example, figure out how to determine someone's creditworthiness from their phone usage, mobile phone usage, right? Because they don't have This is for financial inclusion of women living in rural areas. They don't have a bank account, so you're trying to predict their credit worthiness figuring out their credit worthiness based on their mobile phone usage, right? It sounds like a great idea. It's a great thing to empower women and have them be part of the financial structure. But at the same time, you have to think about when you're doing this kind of determining someone's credit worthiness, what kind of biases might you be encoding, right? Can you be unfairly saying that this person is not credit worthy when they actually are? So these are the kinds of things we should all be thinking about. Right now, any model can be used by anybody for anything. If I release a face recognition model, some law enforcement person can use it. Somebody can use it for an autonomous weapon. There's nothing that says, here is what my model is, here's some standards, international or national, whatever. You should only use it for this task, you should not use it for this task, etc. And I think the first thing we need to do is to have standards and documentation. So when you think about like higher view, it is possible that it could be breaking existing laws, anti-discrimination laws for hiring, right? But nobody knows because nobody's testing it, nobody's auditing it, nobody's doing the kind of auditing that Joy and I did for these different error rates of these different face recognition systems. And I just want to say other industries have been there. So here was a question that you were asking if AI was different. And so, so in electronics, I used to be a hardware engineer. There's lots of standardization, and there's this concept of a data sheet. So when you have a component, no matter how cheap or expensive it is, it always comes with this thing called a data sheet that describes its non-idealities, temperature characteristics, etc. We do all sorts of stress tests on it before we release it into the wild, right? And we release it with this data sheet to talk about intended use cases, what kind of tests you've done, what you shouldn't use it for, etc., etc. And so I'm advocating for something like that for APIs, models, and data sheets and data sets. We need information about if you have a data set, how did you collect it, what were you thinking, what's the population distribution, etc. And so if you're interested in that, there's a paper called Data Sheets for Data Sets, fleshing out this idea. And so another example I want to give is cars, right? So when cars first came on the road, there were there was no regulation whatsoever. There was no stop signs or driver's licenses, drunk driving, age limit. There were all sorts of accidents. And when they were doing crash tests, they did crash tests with prototypical adult male, characteristics. So they had these dummies with adult male characteristics. And so studies showed then subsequently that all these cars were disproportionately killing women and children. So in an accident, women and children would be more likely to die than adult men because they were doing the tests on dummies with prototypical male characteristics. So it took many years for people to start regulating the fact that you needed to also test with dummies with different physical characteristics. And there was also in the US a court opinion on whether or not the automobile was evil, inherently evil, which is interesting because that's the kind of conversation we're having about AI right now. Very interesting is clinical trials. In the US, they used to be illegal, but there was also a lot of experimentation, unethical experimentation on vulnerable populations. And once again, women were not part of clinical trials, and neither were many different groups of populations. And then what happens is that you release this drug into the wild without testing on women, and again, 8 out of 10 drugs that were pulled out of market disproportionately affected women. And this is actually very, very important because once again, people are doing genetic testing, they're working on personalized medicine, etc., and they're completely ignoring Africa. 99% of all the studies that they're doing has no African genes, and African genes are the most diverse set of genes in the world. And this is very dangerous because that means whatever drugs that we're going to consume will not work on us, right? This is very similar to what's going on in AI. We're not participating in the data gathering process and the testing process, and so then whatever AI we consume, imagine we use the face recognition system that I was talking about earlier on, darker skinned women or whatever, and it's not going to work very well on this continent, right? So I just want to say that it took many years for standards to be in place, and we have a lot of opportunities in AI, but we should take these things kind of seriously. We should take it with caution, and we should learn from other industries. Cool?
Okay. Yeah. So I wanted this section. It's mostly to be interactive. I can put up questions, but now already the questions out of the bag. You're supposed to nicely get hidden. But anyway, because I think that's where most people are grappling with these challenges of I want to do work, I want to work in a specific thing, but then there's these questions that come up of what I should be doing and I can't be doing. And on the other side is there's these larger kind of implications for society. So I don't know if there's questions that are going to come from the floor first, or then, okay, seems we're kind of already kind of good to go. But actually before that, I think for Marky, it's important that you maybe, I don't know, but you were on the panel.
Yeah.
So everybody actually knows everybody. Yeah. So it's actually good, yeah. Yes, more time for, yeah, because I spoke with yesterday and things. So, okay, so actually we're primed on there. So let's maybe take 2 questions at a time and then we'll get the panel then to discuss some of these. Okay, I'll start here.
That's a bit for the speakers who work in ethics and AI, maybe a little bit more. I was listening to someone from Princeton speaking about this issue who's very well versed in it, and he said that on conferences, the AI panels are usually just, ethics panels are usually just a wild card for scientists to sleep or talk about whatever they want. And then there are always the philosophers who have these robotic Star Wars slides of and have no idea what's actually happening. So does this topic now become a bit more serious? Because, for example, with the European data regulation, there's money involved now. Because all of a sudden, oh, you can't actually employ your neural network in insurance companies anymore because someone can actually take you to court and ask, why did you not give me that loan? So do you see this change of people taking it more serious because all of a sudden it's commercial? Or will that take a while?
Yeah, that's one. And another question is also, I'll take that.
I want to know what the panel's, I guess, operational definition of bias is.
Okay. Talking about wildcards, there was one wildcard. Okay. Yes. You can come up. Omake Vitani is from the Department of Science and Technology. She's the Assistant Director in Bilaterals. And this was mostly the, sorry. Superstar in the background for a lot of things that we've been trying to do at the Indaba, and we try to bring it on also kind of for policy because I think some of the questions should be on there. So let's start with the kind of ethics questions.
Can I try that for a second?
Yeah.
Ethics and artificial intelligence, I think, I don't think, like you said, the money is making it such that you can't just ignore it. It's actually becoming an operational problem. And one of the things one of the trends I've been seeing related to this is this idea that when you talk about AI policy, or refer to AI policy generally, it's really an applied version of philosophy, an applied version of ethics. How do you talk about accountability and trust for an intelligent system that doesn't have human characteristics? What's the nature of trust? What's the nature of bias, as the person asked? So I think it's more fundamental than just that there is more money in the space. The questions are legitimately hard and they require a rethinking of what ethics means in a world where it's not just humans anymore. I think for the question of bias, I don't know if that answers your question adequately, but I'm sure that people will tune in. The question of bias, I think that's a very poignant question. It's a question we have to struggle with, especially when we start talking about context and application-specific deployments of algorithms. But there is a sense that you know it when you see it. If you create an algorithm that's supposed to be helping with hiring, and you're finding that it's not hiring the best possible people, in fact, it's eager to hire, it's missing out the whole demographic of people, it's having higher errors in that space, then that's bias in a sense. Now, there's also the issue that the term bias, technically speaking, yeah, exactly.
Oh,
yeah. So the term bias is interesting because if you think about what machine learning models do, they're essentially learning biases to answer a predictive question. They're trying to figure out what's the right hyperplane for separating species. So yes, the term bias is unfortunate in the sense that there's a positive and negative sense to it. But when you talk about negative bias, which is what you're talking about for the most part here, it's not an arcane thing. It's you go through life, you're making decisions. It's disproportionately affecting one group versus the other. That's bias. I don't think it requires a much more doctrinaire definition.
Yeah, like when you see, man is to computer programmer as woman is to homemaker, clearly that's bias, right? Societal bias that's encoded. Because woman can also be or man is to doctor as woman to nurse. That's basically the bias that's in our training data that's showing up. Now there's like, this has relationships to, anyways, it's a long conversation, but then there's also a question of what does fairness mean then there's that we haven't figured that out yet. We have lots of definitions for fairness. We're trying to mathematically encode it, and still there's like new definitions coming up, so.
So on the question of being able to regulate and taking this conversation quite seriously, I think policymakers had left it to the techies to regulate themselves, which was very dangerous. And I think with the tech industry as a whole, you find that there's a huge disparity between policymakers and tech makers. And unfortunately, until we have the tech makers being part of the policy making, it's very difficult to put rules and regulations around algorithms that take decisions on a country's economy. For example, if you decline loans to women, black women, for whatever reason, depending on the training data or whatever that went into the model that you actually designed, it has an adverse economical impact on any country around the world. So I think for a long time, advanced technologies such as AI have been left to companies like that. And I think looking at many governments, looking at Facebook, trying to account to policymakers who are clueless about what Facebook actually does and what's the impact of the data that they were taking and using, it was a wake-up call to say, actually, should we really be leaving the regulation to the techies to regulate themselves? So I think it's not necessarily that there's financial implications related to it, but it's more and more the carnage that comes with all the technology. There's cars, autonomous cars. We don't even need to go into the impact of that in different countries. So I think it's kind of like waking up to what is the carnage that's coming with leaving these guys to actually regulate themselves. And I'll leave the bias. I think the bias aspect has been touched on quite well.
Actually, as you're doing that, I think to add a little bit onto that, I think just leading from that policy kind of implications for kind of Lynette and OKay, like how should policymakers be thinking about this in terms of it's still a tough thing. We're in South Africa. Just this week, there's probably 3 machine learning and AI related conferences in the Western Cape. Right? So obviously this is the best one. Alright, but then we've been looking at and then there's the 4th one, which is ITU in Durban. Right? So there's 4 now that kind of are connected and people are speaking. And we've been very lucky to have some policymakers here, but what are these kind of larger themes that we should be trying to engage with policymakers on, both on the topics that are today's ethics part, but also in the broader societal kind of thing. So I think Lynette and OKay, if you could also, given that question, also touch on those.
Okay. Yeah. I will go to bias first and then come to that. And just to what Lynette said in her presentation, sometimes when you lack some communities in decision making,
the people who are in the room tend to make decisions depending on what they know. And to go to Ocean, they say it could be positive or negative. For instance, if you go, I'm told that if you go to some parts of Russia and you're black, chances are people will be taking pictures of you because they've never seen a black person before. If you left engineering in AI to those people, chances are they will never come up with an algorithm that is going to be representative in that way. A very, what I call silly example is, for a very long time we did not have black toys for black girls. And the world of black people was quite upset and said, hey, why don't we have toys for our kids that look like our children? And unfortunately, on my end, I say because we do not have enough black people developing toys for kids. So chances are there's not going to be black, toys for black kids. So it's about representation, I think. People sometimes, I would say, are not biased, and bias is pretty much the exclusion of an idea or a community in the representation of something. Sometimes I'm not biased intentionally. I'm not saying that the people who go sit in a room and say, let's develop AI that does not recognize black people or people of color. But it's more, these people have not been exposed to enough of, enough diverse cases, and in some cases then you do not have enough people in the room who are diverse in that way. So it's a whole chicken egg situation, but we need to expose people a little more. And when we're talking about what kinds of policies should people be, policy makers, and I'm thinking governments and such should be focusing on when it comes to this. There needs to be a separation between people's roles and them as human beings. What I find is, depending on where you are, for instance, you are in government and this, you're going to benefit from a particular, legislation being passed, for instance, with the GDPR, governments are going to make money. So if you're a member of parliament at that point, of course you're most likely going to say yes, let's do this because revenues for governments from companies that are going to violate these regulations. But then some of these guys leave government, then they go out and become consultants for these firms, and then they start helping these firms to try and figure out ways to go around some of the policies that they actually then voted for. So my question to this question is, how do we kind of separate ourselves from the role we're in at a certain point to say what is the ethical thing to do in this situation as a human being, beyond as a policymaker, an academic, or an engineer? It's as a human being. What would I do? I'm sorry, I'm talking a bit too long. I sit in a group of entrepreneurs, about 30 entrepreneurs, and we meet every month. And last week's meeting, I was talking about, for instance, in Kenya right now, and I think you touched on that, there's a lot of data that is being collected about people when it comes to financial inclusion. And one of the apps, well, actually the biggest micro-lending app in the terms of conditions, says that they have the right to actually edit your text. So you accept to that, so they can actually read and edit your text and calls. And I say this is something that I'm going to kind of fight with the Ministry of Information. And someone say, please don't make the fight too hard because we are about to get into micro-lending and we don't want to be regulated, too much. So at that point, I'm thinking, this is my friend who's about to get into that business, but I don't do micro-lending, but I generally don't think it's right the way that they do it. So how do I separate myself from this is my friend who's about to get into that business to there's someone out there who will never read the terms and conditions but gives this kind of right to someone?
as a wild card, good morning. So I think from a purely policy perspective, especially in the African context, it's quite important for African governments to start having these conversations, right? That's the first point. And I think for me right now, having this conversation with you guys is the first step. So let me just give you a bit of a background. At the DST, we've got about 22 bilateral agreements with African countries. And of those 22 bilateral agreements, ranging from both East, West, Central, North, SADC countries, we've never had discussions about AI, let alone policy around that. In none of our activities do we even start talking about artificial intelligence. It's always been around biotechnology, it's purely those kinds of stuff. So it's the start of the conversation that I feel would be quite critical. And I think African governments need to make a concerted effort to ensure that we have these kinds of conversations, one, before we can even start talking about are we supporting young people sufficiently. It's about having these discussions. And it's quite critical that policymakers start understanding what it is that you do. Because I'm sitting here and I barely understand like 5% of the stuff that you guys are talking about. But I think at a policy level, having discussions with individuals and with Bugosi, understanding what are some of the implications for the work that you do, for cross-border collaboration, what are the implications? That is a starting point for us to start talking about what are some of the policies and regulations that we need to put in place. So from a government point of view, we never have all the answers. And I think the first mistake that is made is the assumption that government will have all the answers. I mean, that's impossible, especially when you're looking at things that, Africa, when you look at Africa, we grow so exponentially. Like you can't expect African government, and politicians, by the way, they have a 5-year term. They will look at things that have like a short-term benefits. Those are things that they use to campaign. So with AI being, obviously having such long-term effects, it's quite important that when you do have these conversations, you look at what are some of the shorter-term and longer-term effects of it, and not just make popular decisions based on what can get you re-elected. So, and what you're saying is that talking about bias as well, and people doing things that could, let me just leave it here.
Sure. Okay. Take it back to the thing. Sorry. To the audience. To the audience. Okay, we'll take one here. Sorry, I'm just trying to also have diversity of the physical space, but we will get nobody on the other side. Okay. 1, 2.
These are the good students at the front. Asking questions.
Question 3.
Huh?
Question 3.
She wants to ask a question.
Okay, let's do the 2 and then.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so really from the DST, you kind of scared me there when you said that DST, they're not talking about AI policies, because I'm aware of the 2019 to 2032 vision of training about 1 million data scientists. So already when... or should I have not touched on that? So already if there's that statement out in the audience and the department is not talking about policies.
So context, I'm talking about cross-border collaboration, not national. So the context is that when we're talking to our partners on the continent, we haven't started having those discussions as yet. As you understand, we are responding to national policies and working with our partners on the continent to ensure that we as a country progress our own national sort of like what we want to do nationally. But I think I'm talking from a bilateral perspective on the continent. So from South Africa's bilateral collaboration with African partners, we have not as yet started those discussions to my best knowledge, and I like I said, context is at a cross-border collaboration type of try? I don't work for DST, but I know that the government has been facilitating a lot of conversations around fourth industrial revolution as a whole, and not necessarily artificial intelligence and the effects. At the same time, we need to kind of understand the competing interests that African countries have. So sometimes you'd be faced with questions of a child can't even go to school, so don't even ask me about artificial intelligence, you know? So every country differs on what is on their list of priorities at that time. But I also feel that as you sitting here in this room, you have a better impact to make in influencing that policy or that standardization in Africa as opposed to waiting for them. So you have the power as a citizen to actually go to the government through the various committees that they have. Like I know they have a social science and technology committee, where you influence how we standardize and what we expect from an African perspective on what should happen with AI and policy related to that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to relate to the example that you had previously mentioned. I came across one of the, I think it was Guy who posted on Twitter or Facebook, I can't really remember, but he posted a sentence where he said, "Today I'm gonna pump the city," and he got arrested because this is what he wrote. But his intention was he wanted just to party. And this was totally wrong. I mean, we just depend on his syntax or the sentence that he wrote, but then after they investigated him, they knew that this is not the right thing. And for me, I think I started to question myself. I mean, like, why can't we combine posts and put human as in a second position when he can verify the actions of the artificial machines, intelligence, whatever. And I think the combination might work better than depending only on artificial systems or humans only, because we basically need both sides together to get a better result. Yeah, I mean, why? Why can't we just combine them? For me, it's very simple.
I think that touches a lot on the challenges of having kind of now these large companies that are headquartered somewhere. And then they also have to understand the context in each and every location that people are using their product. So I'll be also looking forward to maybe an answer towards that. Given that since the previous question was answered.
So mine's kind of two-part. So given everything that's been said in today's session, it feels like the biases that that our AI is picking up is inherently like societal biases that the AI is just like learning from. So first of all, like how much truth is in that statement? Like how much is it that the AI itself isn't biased, but it's just like seeing the biases that are inherently in the system. And can we then use the AI itself to learn those biases that we can then, like instead of I don't know how to word this. Instead of like the biases being like using the biases that show up through the AI to then better society in that sort of sense. Like how much can we like move towards that kind of point of view?
The question. Yeah, sure.
So my question for the panelists and anyone else is it possible for policymakers to catch up with innovation and to probably see beyond what is already being innovated? And I'll give a good example. If you go on Twitter, there's this account called code_wizard that recently did an analysis of like all apps in Kenya, and all banks have apps, even like literally there's an app for everything. And the kind of information that they are collecting and the kind of information that is just publicly available to everyone, if you just go through their almost non-existent security, is crazy. So how do policymakers catch up with what is happening? Because it feels like we are creating policies 10 years after things have gone wrong. Yeah.
So, okay, so there's three things. It was basically context awareness and putting the human in the loop because of that. Then it was the machines just codifying the biases we already have, and then how can policymakers then catch up?
I'll go and answer his question. AI is basically, machine learning is a small aspect, but one of the most significant ones, but it's just a part of AI, and I think specifically this touches on machine learning. Of course, the machines have to learn from somewhere, right? And they're going to, and as they're learning, they're going to get what we then define as bias. And you're absolutely right that, then these machines, we should teach them how to catch this kind of bias. If you're having a conversation with someone and you say, hey, that color is blue, and they say, no, I think that's red, you learn, oh, okay, actually, yeah, that's red, right? So you've had someone to check something that you thought you knew before, and now you have learned something new. And I think that's exactly how these machines then learn. I spent the past few months convincing myself that I left the picture that Tim has had before. When we talk about, we look at things like cyborgs and stuff, that we make them in the shapes of humans so they're more acceptable. But when you think about it, I could look like this desk and still do the same exact thing that it's doing, yeah? So it's up to us to then teach, just back to this question, to remove that kind of bias, to be able to teach and bring them to a form where the result that we're getting from the training data and from the interactions is then more acceptable. To your question, Udoni, unfortunately, when you look at most countries, legislators, no offense to lawyers, I once wanted to be a lawyer, legislators tend to be lawyers. Members of parliament, senators, governors, and every so often we have a doctor. I do not know that we've had a computer science or a scientist who's successfully, there probably are some cases, but I don't think it's an overwhelming majority. When you look at, for instance, the Committee on Technology in Kenya, it's not full of technologists, it's full of members of parliament who are lawyers. There's always been praise around how, I'm sure we're mostly familiar with M-Pesa and how M-Pesa came and legislation followed. And sometimes legislation can cripple innovation when you over-legislate an environment and then ask people to work around certain bounds, because then there's so much you can do. But then you're right that probably there needs to be some kind of futuristic thinking from legislation. But as she said, these guys, some of them are in power for 5 years, so they're going to look at their big four type agendas that are going to advance people voting for them, and sometimes thinking about how to create smart AIs in 20. There's, I think, someone who said, not someone, well, wise Africans before say you should be able to plant a tree for your future generation to get shade, right? Not necessarily for you, but a lot of people, unfortunately, do not.
And I think just piggybacking on that point, it will require young people as well to be part of the solution, honestly speaking. We tend to be more reactive because, first of all, I'm probably one of the youngest people in my department. When I start thinking futuristic, there's so much bureaucracy that, there's so many red tape, so many stumbling blocks that if I had similar people of my age group in government with me, pushing the envelope, pushing the boundaries a little bit, thinking about the future, because everything we're doing now, it cannot be for us, as she said. It literally is for future generations that will come after us. But we need to start pushing boundaries a little bit more, stop being reactive, and start thinking about ways in which we can, if there are, what do they say, if you bump into a wall, sometimes it's not even about breaking that wall, it's about finding a way around it. So I think we need to start being a little bit more, to say, creative about the policies that we put in place, but maybe not be so much reactive. If we do continue with these kinds of conversations, I think you've got technical people who are able to advise and foresee what are some of the challenges. Like yesterday when I was in that session, the startup session, they were talking about diversity in your team. And I think when coming to policy decision making, when you've got a diverse team, I think then you can touch on different aspects of policy.
I don't have as much to say about that one, but I was going to talk about. So on the point about whether biases are built in or they come from the data, I think I tend to use the data direct vulnerability. It's coming from the data because it's a simple thing for people to grasp, because it's an explainable way for policymakers, non-technical thinkers, to understand how bias works. But there is going to be definitely some versions of biases that come into the way you frame your model. I used the example of a model we used to create for health policy, where the researcher made assumptions about what a household looks like: a man, a woman, and 2 kids, or a couple of kids. Most families nowadays no longer have that structure. So building that into a model is not data-based, but it is a form of bias. I also want to point out a couple of programs. So DARPA is doing some work in which they are taking this idea of bias and not necessarily thinking about it as a bad thing, but thinking about it as a good thing in the sense of being able to create signatures of cultures. So what is discourse, political discourse in the United States, how is that different from political discourse in China? Can you recognize those differences based on the way people are using languages, based on the bias in the use of language? On the point of policy, how to get policymakers to be more savvy, I think there is a tendency among the AI conversation on policy to assume that good policy must come from technically savvy policymakers. And I'm going to suggest that maybe that's a bit of an extreme position. Like, we've had technologies for the past 200, 300 years of civilization, and they didn't require technically savvy policymakers to regulate. There is a sense that I deal with policymakers quite a bit because I work in a policy think tank, and when it comes to AI, one of the things that comes up is there is the hype, the AI hype cycle is making it difficult to even think clearly about what they are supposed to be regulating. So if you're thinking about trying to scale up, level up on policymaking, I would improve our ability to explain what the hell you're doing to policymakers. That is important. So when I build a model for a client, for a policy client, I don't tell them, oh, I use backpropagation to train this thing, and nobody cares about that. I say, this is the goal of the model, this is why I did this, these are the problems you should be worrying about. Being able to have those non-technical conversations about your model is going to be important for policy making. And there's also roles we play by professional organizations like ASILOMA, AAA, IEEE, trying to set forth principles that will inform policymakers who are not going to be technical.
Yeah, I'll mostly answer your question. But I'll say that with the conference past start, that's what we're trying to do. It's primarily computer science venue that is bringing together legal policy people, lawyers, etc., social scientists, so that, because we believe that this issue has to be tackled, in an interdisciplinary manner. Also, in terms of societal biases, I just want to say one thing is that you can create technology that, even if you didn't have societal biases before, you could create a new underclass, and that's one thing some of us are thinking about. For example, one example is that speech recognition. It doesn't work very well for kids, and all of a sudden, if you have, I don't know, like let's say I'm just gonna make some stuff up, like all of your accident emergency related things are based on speech recognition. Now kids are gonna be, or like the automobile example, right? Like there's not, you don't have to say, there doesn't have to be some ingrained societal bias against kids. It's just that when you're creating your technology, then you have them in mind. Now you can create like a new group of people that's unfairly treated. The content moderation, it's actually, I think it's very complicated. These social network companies, again, they have been unregulated for a long time. Are they a media platform? Are they a publishing platform? They've been trying to say no. They're just allowing content places, but now they're starting to have their own kind of version of rules of what free speech means, what hate speech means, what's not. And actually, there was a whole podcast called Post No Emo that was really interesting. So you have to, even if you hire people to do content moderation, which is basically figuring out whether this person is content, violates Twitter principles or something like that. This person who's deciding that has to understand the context, and even if they understand the context, they're still going to have their own opinion about this, right? So the issue with content moderation right now is like minorities in every place are being targeted because someone reports them, says, an example was non-religious people in religious societies or religious people in non-religious societies being reported. And so this is not necessarily an AI, not AI thing, but it's pretty complicated. Also, and then another thing about whether or not to use AI for this versus people plus AI, it's, I was always I was saying, okay, like our tools are not ready, so we should not use them for content moderation, but then you see the people who, like there are people employed by these companies, their entire job all day is to see content and see whether it's okay or not. And these people see content like that is terrible and they have PTSD. And so now I'm like, yes, if we need to try to have AI that replaces these people's jobs, so this is not fair for them to go through this because they do have PTSD when they get into it. Human AI interaction, that's another complicated thing. So if you look at examples would be from autopilot. So when you look at accidents, plane accidents, a lot of times we haven't, even for that, people haven't figured out how to transition well between the human and the automated system. So when like the human needs to take over versus the automated system, and then like accidents happen then. So I agree with you that if we need to work more on human AI collaboration, but that collaboration is not simple.
Okay, I'll do two more questions from the thing. Okay, that's great actually. We'll go there and then go there, and I'll try to put in some words and then we can try to.
So we all agree that it is. So we all agree that it is has to be more present. We know that AI has a huge impact in population and society. But how do you address the question of ethics without bringing the population into the table? How do we bring civil society into the table to discuss those questions, even though they are not societies, but they have their own ideas, values, and ethics has a lot to do with values, with moral and human behavior. How do we bring people who work in social studies, those who work in history of sciences,
networking, history of arts also, to come together and share ideas, because it feels like this question of ethics and policy from the citizen point of view is monopolized by scientists. So how do we, isn't it dangerous? So how do we do that? How do we interest these people who are in this field to come to the table and share things about?
So sort of, I think it touches on a whole lot of what's been discussed already, but my feeling is that as academics and technologists, we need to look at how can we build tools and make available tools which make these things more transparent to the existing framework for moderating and regulating and controlling technologies and society. And so I guess my question is, along the lines of the data sheets and maybe kind of criteria about maximizing confusion, things like that, are there any great ideas that people have about how to get more of these tools in the hands of people making decisions? I mean, there's a parallel in gerrymandering in the States. Recently, there's been work done where economists have kind of published metrics about how gerrymandered a particular district is. Are there sort of equivalent things that we can provide as tools which then civil society government can ask corporations to implement on their systems, which can give visibility on the fairness, etc.?
So yeah, great questions on there. Actually, my note was on accountants, especially for Margie, to kind of connected to that, the question about bringing in other people was, yes, how do we inculcate our values into the way that we do our work in the kind of this technological era, and kind of what are things people are sitting in here as. You might not think of yourself as a decision maker, but we're all making micro decisions. Every time you write that line of code, right, there is a micro decision out there. Every time we come up with that next algorithm. So how do we bring that in? And then the rest of the time, I guess, then also the understanding of what are these tools or things people should have in their tool belts to get them also to then get one, to be able to do that.
I think what I'll turn your questions into we should and not should. I'll give you an example. So a colleague of mine is a mobile app developer, and she developed this mobile app for stockpile. So in South Africa we have women who come together, they save money and they buy whatever it is that they want to buy. It's called a stockpile. And in that app, she depicted money with a piggy bank, because a piggy bank in another context means saving money, right? But not in the context of those women. The piggy bank actually meant a pig, which they don't eat pigs, and pigs mean something else in their culture, in their context, right? But being able to have those women questioning the piggy bank there then made the app developer reflect on the fact that actually I should have had these women around the table to begin with, before actually releasing the app that I released to the community. And so I'm going to support what you're saying in that we need to create forums, and I think this is a good example of that. And next time probably we need to consider the fact that it shouldn't be computer science degrees sitting on this panel. You know, it should be social scientists, it should be historians. And more academic institutions actually recognizing that by, for example, giving degrees that give me an opportunity that if I am a computer scientist, I should be able to choose an elective from philosophy. I should be able to choose an elective from the social science side, because we are building techies who are building technology that is not going to be used by techies, by being used by the common man in the street. So yes, we need to create more and more platforms such as these. I mean, when it comes into the issue of ethics and morals and our value-based system, that is also kind of context dependent. I can say that, and I think our two speakers spoke very well on that, about how China have got their own way of morality system that they view. And I think that sparking conversations like this enable us to teach the next generation of developers to have those questions at the back of their mind. If I'm going to develop something in Ubuntu, which means I am a person because of other person, is central to what I believe in, then I'm able to create an algorithm that speaks to that. And in whatever way I execute, being able to extract data, being able to handle data, process it, going outside, whether I like it or not, my value-based system is entrenched within that. What was the other question again?
I don't know, is there one person who wants to check that out?
So, yeah, you asked a really hard question. You asked the important question of how do you infuse values, user values into technology. That's a problem that's increasingly taking up a lot of my time. I want to point out a couple of I think most people here would appreciate this because most people here are techies. There's the work on universal enforcement, learning way we learn preferences, learn policies from how people actually operate. There's a different version of that done by work in Stanford where they learn resolutions to ethical dilemmas from how people actually rate ethical. Like the survey was trying to do that. Like, what do you think should be the answer to this question? And they use those values, those implicit values to infuse, to essentially design the systems. But it's going to be ongoing work. It's a hard question. That's the best answer I can give it.
Okay. You asked about how to bring social scientists to the table. So I will make a plug again for FatStar, a conference that I would like more Africans to participate in. It's basically a conference on fairness, accountability, transparency of social technical systems, but it's at a computer science venue, but the papers that we have are from philosophy, from social science tracks. I mean, we have computer science like math, whatever, those kinds of tracks too, but we have also philosophy, history of, like you said, there is a paper on 50 years of a history of fairness, legal scholars, civil society, the ACL, in the US it's like the ACLU, and we also want to move the conference around. So, and many of these groups that are doing, like for example, I was at FATE at Microsoft, and half of them were social scientists and like ethicists and philosophers, and half computer science. And in our group, Meg and I want to hire actually more. We're trying to figure out within the Google structure how to have more, how to hire more philosophers and social scientists, etc.
I'll just point out that I run projects on fairness and algorithms at RAND, and I make it a point not to hire more than 2 or 3 engineers on projects. Like a third of my project teams have some philosophy backgrounds. I always have a lawyer because most of the time when you're designing policy systems, there are laws you have to worry about. And I tend to have an economist because they have done a lot of thinking about how decisions affect efficiency, market efficiency, and stuff like that. It's hard to talk across the board on a project like that. It's going to require some training.
Very, very lastly, I think for me, just kind of combine both questions. It's about making it relevant. How did you bring people to the table? You make it relevant. If we talk about government, talk about, in most cases, you find people make presentations with Star Wars type, things. If people are not interested in that, I mean, if you're getting geeks, then it makes sense. But if you're getting civil society, if you're getting government, what kinds of tools? You have to probably create some AI in budgetary allocation or resource allocation, So it's about making it relevant, no matter what. How do we make technology relevant to the stakeholders that we want to bring to the table? So depending on what you need, depending on how you want to engage with them, find examples, find models that kind of answer their questions, because then it kind of makes it
I would like to become friends with you, like really, really close. Honestly speaking, relevance is quite important. And when you start wanting government support for such initiatives, you need to be able to display, you need to be able to tell me what you're developing is going to be able to address a need for someone in a village, in your country. I think that's the most important part of it. But when you start talking all sorts of things that I sort of can't even begin to imagine, okay, when I start discussing with my counterpart in Kenya, how am I even going to bring this to the table? How am I going to explain to them that they need to put on the table X amount of money for us to develop or for us to support scientists who are going to work on this? How am I even going to explain this when I myself don't even understand it? You know, because that becomes very difficult, and that's where you sort of have the disjunction between what you want to do, what government priorities are, and then what being able to see how you're going to be able to address or help them address issues that are sort of societal importance. So it's about talking about, maybe starting a discussion about AI for development. AI as an inclusive, sector. I think those are some of the discussions. You need to take it down to a very basic level, a very societal level before you can talk about high level stuff.
I think to close on this one, it's I've been saying this a little bit to a couple of people over the week. We're here. We are, I don't know, the magicians of the South, right? Because that is what people are starting to see us as. Right? You're becoming rock stars, and it's really important that you don't forget the society that you're living in, right? So what's been said by Lynette and over again is very important. I've had situations where I've gone on and done like literally the simplest machine learning talk, not the one with all the math, the whiz bang, the new frontiers and all those things, but then going into a community or a part of society where you just say, oh, you're hearing all this noise, right? Fourth Industrial Revolution, artificial intelligence, all of that and things like that. Right now, I need you to give you a short primer that will situate you on what this actually is. And I'm not going to go and scare you with, whether it's cyborgs and all those things, but understand this. And you will not believe how many people come out and come to you at that presentation and just go like, oh, that's it? That is it. Oh, and then now I can see the connections. So they will understand how, when you then say we inculcate bias just from the data that you're collecting, they actually understand what it means. Instead of that just being a statement of the data is biased, you put it into machine, the machine becomes biased. They don't understand what the machine is doing. Right, so just doing that is very important for us because it touches on both. It will bring in that when you're now kind of interacting with society, they will ask you those ethical questions of saying, but what if? Right, and then that brings back, then you're looking more on having a conversation that is at the same level. Right, we will tend to push back and say, well, you don't understand. Right, and that is not useful. Right, that is not useful because you really do not want to be, the reason that this comes up is you're on the headlines for something really bad having gone on. Right, so to have those conversations means that you have to have kind of like really do, if you get the opportunities to speak, find out your audience and get to them and then bring them into this fold. Yes, challenge us. We also know what you're doing. I think when Obama said that, we also don't have answers. Yeah. We don't have answers. This is an ongoing kind of discussion. Let's give a round of applause for the panel. People will still be around, so do interact with them, do ask the tough questions, do submit to conferences, do tweet at the Indaba with your examples of challenges in your community that are going on so that we can also capture that. We'll we'll get all the presentations online. If you've been writing notes and you want to share them too, you can email me so that we can share with everybody about what actually was being discussed in this session. Thank you, and yeah, let's quickly rush to the main auditorium.